this is part 2 of 2 for migrating to ZOS 2.2. My email's on the cover. Please, email me if you have any questions, and don't forget to do your session evaluation as also. Okay, so what I want to talk about in 2.2 is I really want to talk about a lot of the migration details. These are the specific migration actions that you're going to see coming from 13 to 2.1 or from 13 to 2.2 or ZOS 2.1 to 2.2. Okay, I'm going to probably focus more on the new migration actions that are getting to 2.2 because everybody's got to cover those. And I've also been talking about migrating to 2.1 for a couple years now, and so if you really need, I'll just cover some of the highlights of that, but if you really need more specifics, there's other sessions and PDF presentations that you can have getting to that, and I can email them to you if you need. Okay, so what I want to do is talk about migration actions, and these are the elements that I've decided that I want to cover in the ZOS 2.2 presentation for this next hour. Okay. So the scope of the presentation is that I have just selected some of them. This is not all of the list of the ZOS migration actions. This is really loud. It's echoing and it's loud. Is that better? Is that better? Okay, God, that was annoying to me. It must be really annoying for you guys. All right, so I didn't include all of them. When I look at the migration actions that are in the ZOS book, there's probably, I'm going to say, a couple of hundred migration actions for a migration path, let's say from 2.1 to 2.2. And so there's no way I can talk about 200 migration actions in 60 minutes. Well, I might be able to because I like to talk really fast, but you guys wouldn't be able to understand it. So I've just picked a couple out that are pretty important to understand. We've also had some early support program customers that have hit a couple of migration actions that I'm going to highlight because they're common that you probably will hit as well. So I want to make sure that we talk about those as well. So it's just a personal view of what I wanted to talk about in this hour. But remember that you do have to use the book for the complete list of migration actions. Now the ZOS 2.2 migration book, the dash level for that is -05. So make sure you have the latest and greatest migration book. And by the way, if you're going to use the OSMF workflow, the workflow is called the -05 level as well. How convenient for that?
So we don't
have question.
all those 100 or whatever migration items in the workflow?
So the question is, do I have all of those 100 or so migration actions in the workflow? And the answer is absolutely. The workflow was created directly from the book. And then, as you saw in part 1, we added health check capability to it and added feedback. So yes, that's exactly what is in the book is exactly what's in the workflow. So the question is, if I don't have OSMF installed and I want to kind of use that thing called the workflow for migration, do you have like a simulator for the workflow? The simulator is the PDF of the book. So there you go. No. So you get the book. You get the book or you get the workflow. Don't use them both. You don't have to use them both, but I prefer the workflow. And I think if you go into workflow and you see what it can do for you, I think you'll be glad that you have the workflow to help you with it. Is the workflow available now? Yes, it is available now. I put it out on announce day. So that was about 2 weeks ago. So it's out there. If you have trouble finding it, let me know. It's on the ZOS installation and migration webpage. Okay, so right at the top, it'll get you right to it because it was kind of highlighted. So it's been out there for 2 weeks. Now, if you do get the old-fashioned PDF book, there's 4 chapters in the book, and you have to understand that if you're coming from 2.1 to 2.2, you're only going to use chapters 1, 2, and 3. And if you're coming from ZOS 13 to 2.2, you're going to only use chapters 1, 2, and 4. Now, when I created the workflow, I created it exactly on the path that you needed, right? So if you're a 2.1 user, I only included chapter 1, 2, and 3 in the workflow. And if you're going to going from 13 to 2.2 in the workflow, it has chapter 1, 2, and 4. So I've already done the separation for you, and then you decide what workflow you want, whether you want the 2.1 to 2.2 workflow, or do you want the 13 to 2.2 workflow. And you decide right then. There's files there for everybody. If you want to look at them all, you can go look at them all. Okay? So you really just pick one of them that you have in there. So here's the ye old definition of a migration action. You guys should know what a migration action is at this point. It's not exploitation of new function. It's just what you have to do in order to get similar behavior from your old system to your new system. all of those great exploitation items that we have that are in 2.1 and in 2.2, that's all exploitation, and that's what you choose to use after you've done your migration. So the first thing you do is your migration. The next thing you do is go shopping for new functions and start turning things on. Okay, so I'm just going to talk about migration. Now, actions, we've always classified them these ways. You guys have seen this, but I'm just going to go over it again, is that you can have required migration actions, which means that everybody has to do it, right? In order to run ZOS 2.2, you have to be on a Z10 or higher. That's required. Everybody's got to do that, right? And then we have the category of required if. So if you are using a certain function, then you have to do this migration action. So it's only applicable to those that have the condition. So I called those required if. And then we have just the recommended migration actions. And I really want you to do recommended migration actions, right? So in ZOS 2.1, I said it was strongly recommended that you get off of Domino and go to the Apache 855 server, right? But what happens in ZOS 2.2 is it becomes a requirement, right? So I tried to give you a warning in 2.1 and even on 13 to do that as a recommendation, but in 2.2 it becomes a requirement. Also, we can have a recommended migration action if it will allow you to improve your work in the future, right? You do this once and then you'll never have to do it again. That's not a bad migration action to do if you can get rid of it. Okay? Then we also classify migration actions into timing. Okay, what can you do now? Now you can get off of Domino and get to Apache 855, right? Or pre-first IPL, not a great term, but it's about the best we could come up with. So before you do the first IPL of the system would be the earliest time in which you could do that migration action. So make a parm lib change, make an automation change, something like that. You can't do it now on your 13 or 2.1 system because you're not running that level. And then we have post-first IPL, which just means that you need the ZOS 2.2 system up and running in order to perform those migration actions. We don't have a whole lot of those. Okay, so luckily it's mostly stuff you can do now or right before you do your IPL if you wish. And then we always have the fire, which I think is an important thing, important or very common for people to use, common that people might hit. And then I have the health check, so you should be using health checker for this. And then the last item I've added recently is a broom, meaning it's a cleanup action. I call these hygiene migration actions. These are just things to clean up your system. And they're not have a bad impact if you forget to do it. However, it might cause confusion because if they're still there, people might think they're in effect when really they're not. Or it might result in a warning message when your system is executing, and I like to keep it nice and clean. I don't want to see warning messages, right? Like warning like, oh, I saw this, but I didn't process it because it's obsolete, right? That should be something you clean up. Okay, so those are called hygiene ones, and I put a little broom next to the items that you really should do for cleanup. So here are all of the elements that have migration actions, and I definitely can't talk about all of them, so I selected some of the more popular ones. I talked about some of them, like Book Manager Build, I talked about in part 1. The migration action is gone, right, in 2.2. And we talked extensively about the IBM HTTP server already. So some of those between the two presentations, I'll be able to cover a lot of the elements and selected pieces of those elements. So let's move right into the migration actions. The first one I like to talk about always are general type of migration actions. So the first one we talk about is just a recommended migration action, and that is to accommodate the new address spaces that we're going to have in 2.2. So the first one, you know, is IBM HTTP server powered by Apache. That will be a new address space when you bring up 9.0. Actually, the address spaces if you bring up 855 as well on ZOS 2.2. The blue items here mean that they're migration associated address spaces. And then if you see some of them are in green, the green ones are associated with exploitation because I wanted to also include exploitation items on this chart, even though I just told you I wasn't going to talk about exploitation, because I wanted to talk about them in the area of address spaces to make sure that you can accommodate any of the new ones that we would have in the whole release. So the next one is the IBM Knowledge Center for Z. Okay, that's going to be new address space. That's an instance of that WebSphere Liberty profile, and it's going to use the WebSphere Liberty that we have shipped in ZOSMF. Okay, and then also ZOSMF, 2 new address spaces, the IZU Angel, and then also the server as well. So 2 new address spaces that you'll see for ZOS 2.2 if you're going to use ZOSMF. In 2.1, we had some address spaces, PCIe and FPGA and just the mere IPLing of ZOS 2.1 or 2.2 on a system. If it was higher than ZEC12 or BC12, you would have those two address spaces initialized or not, depending on what hardware level you're running. It has nothing really to do of the ZEDC or the Rocky features. Just IPLing on the hardware server level will give you these two address spaces or not. There's nothing you need to do. No security setup, nothing you need to do. Just leave them alone. Okay. Health checker is a new address space on ZOS 2.1. It's not new if you're already using it, but it's new because we're going to start it for you as new. And so everyone's going to have it on ZOS 2.1. And also we have generic tracker on 2.1. So we'll talk about that. And then JES2 converter interpreter have many new address spaces depending on how much you want to exploit with those functions. Okay, so another one in the general category, the first bullet is removed references to removed data sets and paths. So I told you in part 1 that we have removed some elements, and these have also resulted in data sets for those guys going away. So you'll see Book Manager builds, EOY data set go away. You'll see the domino removal of IMW data sets, and some paths as well. SCSF has gotten rid of some DLibs, and public key infrastructure has removed IHS7 because they now will run with Apache Server 9.0. Okay, add new data sets. Okay, so now we've had some new functions that come in ZOS 2.2. They're associated with new data sets. And we also have existing functions that have added new data sets as well. So we've got some new XLC, C++ data sets. And here's the new IBM HTTP server powered by Apache. Those new data sets are going to start with HAP, HTTP server Apache. That's what that is. HAP, those are the new 9.0 Apache data sets that you'll see. Also, I wanted to point out that the IBM HTTP server powered by Apache, IHSA, that is going into a directory called user LPP IHSA _ZOS. That is a brand new directory that we decided on the name of. That's where the IHSA is going to go for ZOS 2.2, and I want to point out there is no VRM on that directory. Whatever level of the IHSA we are shipping, it is going into that directory name. Okay? We had a lot of internal arguments about whether we wanted VRM on that directory name, and because it is an element of ZOS, it doesn't get a VRM. It's the VRM of the operating system. Okay? Is that clear? Okay, so just be aware, it's IHSA _ZOS. Also for ZOSMF, we've got a new DLib, and the path there, you'll see user LPP ZOSMF for ZOSMF, and there is no VRM on that. It is a base element of ZOS, and ZOS does not get VRMs, if you haven't already noticed that. The KC for Z, its characters are HKC, and its path name you're going to see is called user LPP KC4Z. That's the new knowledge center for Z functions that you see. Okay. And let's move down to the last one for health check customization. We always have new health checks, we always have changed health checks, and we always delete some health checks, it seems. So the migration here for you is that if you are modifying a deleted health check, you don't need to anymore because it's not there. So clean up your customization of a removed health check. Also, if you are changing a changed health check, our date on the check is probably going to be higher than your date on the check. And so you need to make sure that our changes and that your changes are all okay for that health check. So you need to look at your HCS PRM ParmLib member and look and seeing what you're doing to the check and looking to see what we did on the check. And so we had 10 checks that changed in 2.2, and so you need to make sure that we're all going to be okay with these checks. Incidentally, the RACF sensitive resource check, which is a very general check that we have for RACF, it has changed in both 2.1 and in 2.2. Okay, so they keep adding more stuff that RACF is changing, or sorry, that RACF is looking at in the RACF sensitive resource check. And then we have 17 brand new checks. So if you run health checker and you're running all clean and you have exceptions, Well, now you've got another 17 checks to make sure that they're running clean as well. You probably won't have all 17 starting on your system. There's one new check for JES3, and you won't see that check unless you're running JES3, right? So you might not see 17 of them, but based on what you're running, when checks are added, mostly through an initialization path in the code, that's how they get into the health checker backbone. And if you never run the initialization code, you never get the check. So that's what I'm trying to say. You might not see all new 17 checks, okay? So let's move on to the BCP migration action. The first one is a recommended migration action. You don't have to do this, but we did notice that a lot of people had never done this over the years, and so we decided that we really would recommend people to do it. So we made it a real migration action. We made it a recommendation only, though. It's not a requirement. We just think that people should be doing this. And that migration, recommended migration action is that your logger coupled data set, it really should be formatted at the highest level we want you to use the highest CDS level for your logger that you support and the lowest level in your sysplex. Well, what is that level? That level is really old. It is ZOS version 1 release 2. That is not a typo. And in order to show you that it wasn't a typo, we even put the year there. The year is 2001. We have discovered, the system logger component has discovered that many people are not even running at the 2001 system logger coupled data set level. And that's why we made this a migration action, a recommended. It's not required. My gosh, you guys have been going 14 years without functions and the logger coupled data set. And if you want to use them, you got to be up at the highest level, which is 14 years old. So please go and reformat your logger coupled data set to get into, the new world here. Okay. So what do you do? How do you know if you have the level? You can type DXCFC, type equal logger, and then you look right down here and you'll see, it should say HBB 7705. That gives you the highest level of the Cupper data set, which is 14 years old. Okay, so please just go and look at that, and it's a recommendation that you format it. If you're going to format it on a pre-ZOS version 2 release 2 system, in order to get that highest level, you're going to need to say on your SM duplex, you're going to need to say number 1. And that will get you up to the higher level of the logger coupled data set if you're running prior to 2.2. So then, associated with this migration action is the second item on this chart, and that's that we're going to change the default so that if you do reformat your logger coupled data set, we're going to give you the highest level, which is a 14-year-old level. Okay, so this should be fine with you, but it is a default change, and all default changes create migration actions. So what we're going to do is we're going to make the number 1 the default after ZOS 2.2, so that in case you reformat your logger coupled data set, then you do get the higher level. Okay? Yes? Is it downward compatible? Yes, it is. And in fact, this level is so old that it's like the level that's everywhere, so we don't even have to put coexistence PTFs out. The release that it became supported in is so far out of service, it's gone. So yes, it's compatible. It's compatible because it's 14 years old and it hasn't changed. Okay, so speaking of coupled data sets, I wanted to mention on the next chart, the ARM coupled data set, Automatic Restart Manager. The ARM coupled data set, now this one is important, right? This is not just a recommendation, this is a requirement. If you are using ARM and you want to continue to use ARM, you must reformat your ARM coupled data set, okay? Now it says in here, for long symbol name support. Now that's the thing that caused the ARM coupled data set to be reformatted, but it has nothing to do with whether you're going to use long symbols or not. Okay? The requirement that you see is the fire that I put here, and the requirement that I'm saying is if you want to use ARM, you must reformat your ARM CDS. Okay? Otherwise, you can have the system join the sysplex, but you will not have any ARM functionality. So that's pretty important, and that's why I put a fire on it here. So how do you know if your ARM coupled data set is at the right level? Well, first of all, if you're running on 2.1 or 2.2 today, it's not at the right level because it was introduced in 2.2. Okay? So what we did was we put an APAR out, OA46977, and marked it with the coexistence fixcat, and that APAR provides coexistence support for this ARM coupled data set. So with this APAR that's on, you can now coexist in a sysplex with different level systems in the support, which is fine. But it also added the ability to do a display command so that you could see what ARM CDS level you have, because before the support you couldn't do a display command for it. So we got the display command support for it like we already had for logger. Okay. So what you'll see with that APAR on, if you do a display XCF type equals ARM, you should see after you've done the reformat that the level is HBB 77 able 0. By the way, HBB 77 able 0 is ZOS 2.2. Okay, so you should see that. If you don't see 77 able 0, then you know you've got to reformat your ARM couple data set. How do you do that? You use the format utility, and you can step lib to the MIG lib that's on your ZOS 2.2 system. That will format it at this level that you can see here. Okay, so this is really clear. This is really important. This is something that people did not do. Early customers did not do this, but it was clearly marked in the migration book you needed to do it. So they just forgot about it, I guess. Okay, so the question is, you have, let's say you have 7 LPARs and you need to move up to this higher level format. And so the question was, does that format have to be done on the 2.2 system? You can format it from your release 13 or your 2.1 system, but you've got to use the utility at the 2.2 level, meaning that you could step lib to that 2.2, but that 2.2 system does not have to be active, right? You could just, all you need is the MIG lib utility from there in order to do it. If you put on the coexistence fix, yeah. Okay, so the question is about, do you still have to put coexistence fix on the lower level releases? Absolutely, you always coexistence fixes on. And when you use that fixcat, it's going to put this one on, which just supplies you with coexistence and also the display command support. Into 2 is where the utility is upgraded so that it will give you the HBB 77 able 0 support. You have to use the utility from the 2.2 system. It doesn't roll back the utility at the level on the lower level system, because that's where all the long system names support, and then that didn't come in those releases, that came in the higher releases. So, make a long story short, you have to use the 2.2 utility to format ARM CDS, and you can use a step lib that works perfectly fine. Okay, so let's move on to some more BCP migration actions. This one I wanted to mention because I'm a real fan of BCPII. I'm a real fan of using BCPII, the rec support that came in 2.1. And with that support, what was provided in BCPII was a little helper program called HWI Rex. And this is a nice little helper program that will allow you in your Rex program to avoid assembler code, right? That would be nice in your Rex program to avoid assembler code when you want to call BCPII services. Okay, so they nicely provided this little helper thing, and this little helper thing is like the middle guy that will get you from, you know, just having to use Rex rather than going into assembler to invoke the APIs. However, the migration action here, as of this APAR, which is on 2.1, is that you have to let HWI Rex have read authority into the facility class profile that you can see here, or else you will get a failure, an HWI Rex return code of 112 decimal, okay? So you need to give the helper program permission to run that Rex exec name that you put there. Okay, you can wildcard that if you want. The next one is actually an interesting migration action. It was introduced, there's one part of it that was introduced in 2.1. And by the way, we didn't even know that it was a migration action in 2.1. We had to have a customer tell us that it was a migration action. And we're like, oh my God, you're right. We didn't document it. And then what we did in 2.2 was something very similar. So then we're like, now we know it's a migration action. We'll tell you about it. Okay. So what it is that parmdd and region X are going to be keywords on JCL exec statement and proc statement. And when we make them keywords as IBM, that means that you cannot use them as system symbols. You can't use them as symbols. We didn't understand that that was a migration action until somebody actually used parmdd as a symbol, and they started getting JCL failures, and we thought, oh my gosh, of course you can't do that, because we made that a keyword. And so we said, that's a migration action. It's really a restriction now at this point. Because as we make new keywords up, you can't, on the JCL and proc statement, you cannot make them system symbols. Unfortunately, that's just the way it is, okay? So parmdd came in 2.1, region X came in 2.2. So now that we are using them as keywords, you cannot use them and symbols in your JCL. That's just the way it's going to be. And as we add more of these here, we will tell you about them in this kind of a method. We're trying, we don't do this very often. So it was a long time in coming when we did this. So here is just some examples that you can see here of offensive statements that you will now see receive JCL errors are. So you can see on a proc, here's a parm DD. Here's an exec proc with a region specified for the parm and an exec program. Here's a parm that also has a parm DD as a symbol. Okay, you can't do things like that. Okay, so parm DD, region X. Okay, real quick on 2.1 this happened. As I told you that health checker is going to start up automatically. Is there anybody here that's not starting health checker today? Okay, you guys need to go and decide what you're going to do about this migration action. I would recommend that you start health checker today on 13. I'm guessing you both start 13. Go start it on 13 so that when we automatically start it on 2.1 or even 2.2 when you migrate, that we're starting the customized health checker that you have. I think it's better that we start your health checker the way you want it rather than us just starting a vanilla one. Okay, so that's what that means. The next one is the tracking facility in ZOS 2.1. This is a new, I like to think of this, I always put tracking facility and health checker together because I like to see them as companion components, and they really are working together to help, especially for migration. I really like those two components. So what we have in 2.1 is generic tracker is a new address space, I said, and you'll see at the IPL time a couple of messages. These are the 4 messages you'll see new. Early on, you'll see IPL time, initialization is starting and complete. And a little while later, you'll see that the full initialization is starting and complete. Now, that just means that generic tracker has been initialized. It does not mean that it's enabled, and it does not mean that it's capturing incidences to remember. Okay, it just means that it's initialized. Then you have to decide, do I want to enable it or do I want to disable? It's disabled automatically by default. If you were using console tracking facility, you need to convert to use the generic tracker. It has a much better format for the parm-lib member. The commands are much easier to understand and I think to use. And there's additional capabilities I think are easier to use, such as printing and stuff. So if you're using console, use generic tracker. Anybody here turning on generic tracker if you're already on 2.1? Only one. Okay. It's a handy thing, and especially if you're going to look at using EAVs, it's very important, and also the new GDGE function coming in ZOS 2.2, generic tracker can help you with as well. Okay, comm server. Anybody have questions about BCP before I move on to comm server? Okay, so comm server, we have a very specific migration action here, but I think I'll put it here because it uses a high level of function that we've been talking about for a while. So this is only if you're on the 2.1 to 2.2 path. If you're on the 13 to 2.2 path, this is not applicable to you. And there's a lot of conditions on this migration action. So it's only for those that are on the 2.1 to 2.2 path. Okay. On 2.1, you could have multiple TCP/IP stacks within the same LPAR that could share a Rocky Express feature and have the same PF ID of that feature defined on the global config SMCR statement. The requirement now is that you can't have the same one defined. You need to each stack needs to have its own PF ID. So you need to go into HCD to find a unique PF ID for each of the TCP/IP stacks, go into global config, and make sure they're separated. Okay? This is only applicable if you're coming on 2.1 to 2.2. You're using shared memory communication via remote direct memory access. You've got the 10 gigabit ether Rocky Express feature in a dedicated Rocky environment, and also you've got to be running on a Z13. So I don't think a lot of people will hit this one, but if you do want to start using this feature, that's also why I wanted to highlight it, is this is a new requirement for how it needs to be configured. Now the second one is enhancement that is turned on automatically for you in communication server. So that's a migration action if it's an exploitation that's turned on and already behaving the new way. That's a migration action. So this is actually, I think, a pretty good exploitation item, but I need to tell you about it because it's a different behavior, and if you want to turn it off, you can. Okay? So what happens in 2.2 is that we have automatically adjusting maximum segment sizes, or MSS, okay? And this is used on TCP/IP connection, this automatic maximum segment size, is ordered to help to avoid fragmentation. So this is a good thing. You can see why we automatically have turned this on. Okay? Now, if you want to turn it off, you're welcome to turn it off. However, you probably have opened yourself up to fragmentation, and then you might be opening yourself up to a performance problem that you might have to deal with. Okay? So if you are going to turn this off, you kind of are taking your performance into your own hand, and you're going to have to adjust it if you have fragmentation difficulties. Okay? So my recommendation would be to keep it on, and auto is on. Auto is the default, and it is on. If you do want to turn it off, you can go into Adjust DVIPA MSS and say None if you want to turn it off. If you're having problems with it, you can turn it off. Okay? But I'd recommend you keep it on as long as it's being okay for you. Okay, more default changes in COM server. Okay? So there's a default for queued RTT round trip time. Okay, now this value is, has this statement, queued RTT, the number that's associated with it is the number of milliseconds or more that a TCP/IP connection has that round trip time that's going to be eligible for outbound serialization. Now the old default was 20 milliseconds or more, and what we're doing is we're changing the default down to 0, meaning that all of those TCP/IP connections are going to be eligible for outbound serialization. Okay, now you can change this if you want. It's just a default change. We're telling you what we've done. You can change the value to be anywhere from 0 to 50 if you want. We've moved it from 20 to 0 as the default. Okay, the next one, the one on the bottom here, is another default, and this is a default storage size for the Communication Storage Manager, CSM. We've changed the size of the fixed storage that we need for buffers. We've doubled it from 100 megabytes to 200 megabytes. You can use the new default. You can change whatever you want. You go into the IVT PRM PARM live member on fix max and you set it. And you can do a DNet CSM to look at what storage you are using. And then look at, this is a real big output from this command, but if you just look right here, you'll see it. And if Rial's looks right there, that should look familiar because I logged onto his system to get this number on this chart. So that's what Washington System Center is using right there. Okay, so that's where I got the sample output for this. So just be aware it's moving from 100 megabyte to 200 megabyte, and I can see that Washington System Center is using 120 meg fixed for their buffers. Okay, COM server. Okay, we have a lot of messages in COM server that always seem to change, and I always get up here and say, okay, COM server is changing messages for, I don't know, the FTP daemon or whatever. So accommodate it with the automation, and that's another thing we've got. Okay, so we have IKE, Internet Key Exchange daemon. The syslog messages are going to look different now. Previously, they looked like these in black, and what we're going to do now new in 2.2 is we're going to insert a thread ID before the message ID. And then this is where your automation also is going to have maybe, I don't know, maybe more problems dealing with this one, is that the threads can now be interleaved together. So you can see an example here of how I had, you know, a message from thread 1, thread 3 came in, and there's another message from thread 1. Okay, so now you're going to be able to tell what the message is, what thread it came from, and they might be interleaved, and you'll be able to tell with the identifier of the thread. Okay, so just keep that into consideration if you have any automation that needs to accommodate this. Okay, these are ZOS 2.1 items that came from COM server, so I'm going to move through that just because I want to make sure I get to all of the important ones for 2.2. Okay, so let's move to DFSMS, DFP. Okay, this is the ref UCB option in DevSep. Now, ref UCB is, the short thing of this is that ref UCB by default is going to be turned on in DevSep. Okay, so ref UCB will allow the system to automatically update the UCB when you have changed a VOLSIR or a VTOC location. Okay, so it's important that the UCB be updated to tell you about the new location of the VOLSIR or the VTOC when you've changed it. It only applies to volumes that are within a sysplex. Okay. If the device is online and the ref UCB processing is happening, it's going to issue a very online unconditional. And if the device is online, there's really nothing for it, or offline, then there's really nothing for it to do because the device is offline. When it comes online, it will have the correct information. So as I said, ref UCB is enabled by default. You might have already turned it on because it's a good function, but now we know it's a good function. We're going to turn it on for you by default in 2.2. Okay? Now, if you want to, you can turn it off. You're perfectly welcome to turn it off. You go into DevSup and you say disable ref UCB. But we think this is a function that everybody should be using, and so we have written a brand new health check for it. Okay? And what is the health check going to do? It's going to make sure that you haven't overridden our default. We like our default of enable. We want you to use enabled, so we wrote a health check to verify that it was enabled. Okay? But what happens if you really don't like this value? You want to disable it. That's fine. You can disable it. Like I said, go into DevSup and change it. But what you also would need to do is go onto that health check and tell it to stop looking for the IBM value and start looking for your own value, which would be disabled. So there's a parameter on the check that you have to also not only change in the parm member, but you need to go change the parameter on the check so that you're not constantly reminded that you're using a default that IBM doesn't like. You want to use the check of the way that you want it, and that means specifying the parameter on the health check, right? So you say enable is no if you want to override us. Okay, now I was in the DFP section, but then I came across an ICK DSF migration action that was kind of related to ref UCB, so I wanted to include it here as well. Okay, now this is as of an APAR on ICK DSF. Okay, so this ICK DSF does a lot of APARs. They don't do release levels hardly anymore. So what we see here is that today we have on init and reformat commands, there's a verify offline parameter, and that verify offline will just say verify that this is offline before I initialize it or before I reformat it. Okay? So with this APAR that you see here, if I have specified a unit on that init or reformat command, and the storage code microcode is a specific level that you can find in the proceedings that I put, and the device is not a mini disk, then it will be as if verify offline is always there, even though you didn't code it. Okay? So, if the device is online when this verify offline processing is happening, remember, whether you coded it or not, if the processing is happening, because by default it will happen if all those conditions hit, if that device is online during it, the command is going to terminate. Okay, so you might say, why did it terminate? You know, I didn't code verify offline, but yet it was looking if it was offline. Well, that's why, because this APAR changed the behavior. Okay, if you don't want that behavior to happen, you can physically go in and add no verify offline to the init or the reformat, and that will negate this behavior from happening. Okay. Okay. Next thing, this one's back to DFSMS, and this one is now in the world of HSM. On the list dump command, you'll see a slightly different output change that you can see here. It's very hard to see, but what you'll see is there's a new min stack value that's going to be provided, and then the stack one is moved over. Now, I know the list command output is not a programmable interface, but I know that a lot of people know list command output very well, and they might be confused if they see a different response. This is for all destinations, whether it's output, data set, or sysout, or terminal, it all looks different. So you can see here that this is the difference you can see. And I think back in JES2 I think this was a new field that was added as well, if I'm not mistaken. So list dump class looks a little bit different in 2.1 and in 2.2. Okay, migration action for 2.1. This is an HSM for a VTOC copy. Default has moved from 2 to 0. And this is another one that came in 2.1. It has to do with the dataset changed indicator bit. You can override that if you want to get the previous behavior by just specifying a reset on the dump command. I'm going through the 2.1 ones a little faster just to make sure I cover the new 2.2 stuff. And FIPS 140 users, if you are a FIPS 140 user, you must be using ICSF, crypto services. It has to be available and up and running, or you won't be able to use FIPS 140 mode. Okay, next one is in the world of DFS. Okay, now usually when I get up here and I talk about DFS, I always talk about ZFS, right? But there's another part of DFS that is a really great function that I love, and that's called SMB. I don't know if you guys use SMB. I use it a lot. I could probably not get my job done without SMB. And we actually have an SMB migration action that's very important that came in an APAR and was incorporated into 2.2. So I want to make sure that if everybody loves SMB as much as I do, that you are very well aware of this migration action, because you won't be able to use SMB unless you follow it after you put that APAR on or when you put on 2.2. Okay, so what happened is before this APAR and before 2.2, the SMB users, they didn't have to specify that medium weight threads were to be kept automatically. Okay, and this really affected when the fix came out. It changed the threading behavior, but SMB needs to go back to the original threading behavior. And so what happened is they added an environment variable, BPX, unused tasks equal keep. And that environment variable has to be put in your file, your SMB DFS control environment file, probably in this location right here, your envar file. You've got to put that environment variable into that file to tell SMB that it's the previous, or actually to tell Unix that you want that previous threading behavior to occur so that SMB can work. Okay? So it's a really easy fix. You just go into that file and you add that statement and you're done. And then you have to cancel DFS and then start DFS. Do not stop DFS and then start it. Just, you have to do a cancel and then a start of DFS. And then you're all done. You're taken care of. Okay. If you don't do this, the SMB server will not start, and then people like me that love SMB will be really mad at you because the users will be coming to your office and yelling at you that SMB is not working. You have to do this, or else you'll get these messages that you can see here. Okay? So DFS, SMB, this one's important. And if you've already done it for the APAR, then you're okay when you go to 2.2. But if you haven't done it yet, be nice to your users and do this for them. Okay, so I have got up here every year, and I have talked about ZFS, and I have talked about all the fire items on ZFS. I have talked about ZFS a lot. And every release, I have fire items for ZFS. And so I said, okay, here's my new slide for ZFS. Well, what have they done to me now, right? In 2.2? Nothing. There are no migration actions for ZFS in 2.2, and I mean none. Not just little piddly ones. There are none. I'm zero. So if you are coming from 2.1 to 2.2 and you're a heavy ZFS user, you can just sit back because there is no ZFS to do in 2.2. And I really like that. The team did an excellent job. I've already talked to them, and they do have migration actions for 2.3. So we're only good on one release. But they did a really good job in 2.2, and they have no migration actions. Now, if you heard John Neal speak, it's not because they didn't have any function. They have a lot of function coming in 2.2. And the thing is, they were really conscious of all the customers out there that are needing to migrate, and they really made every change a compatible change. They have no migration actions, and yet they have done all of these functions and more. Good stuff. Okay? So if you see a ZFS person, tell them thank you because they gave you no work to do, and they gave you good stuff too. So I appreciate that. Okay, so if I go back to 2.1, I see, oh, here's another fire item for ZFS, right? And this is that you had default changes for the cache. And this has actually come around. A lot of customers still have questions about this, even though they've been on 2.1 for a while. These cache sizes, the meta cache size, the meta-bat cache size, and the user cache size, the defaults are changing, okay? Typically, the default is going to be about 10% of real storage now. Some people like that, and some people don't like it. Some people want to overwrite it. Some people are just going to let it take the default and keep an eye on it, okay? So just keep an eye on this. If you're already on 2.1 and you're running okay, you're good, but you hopefully recognize that there was 3 cache default changes that might have increased the cache size a lot. By the way, if I go back to that one slide before here, 64-bit support for cache and ZFS. Big cache sizes now, right? This is great. They were restricted before with only 31-bit cache, and it really limited some of the performance of ZFS. But now that we have 64-bit cache, we have really big cache sizes, and we can see a lot better performance in ZFS. Okay? And all without a migration action, they did it for 64-bit. It was great. World of JES2, I already talked about Z11 mode. Just going to really warn you, you cannot fall back to Z2 mode if you're on ZOS 2.2. You must be on Z11 mode before you get to 2.2. When you're on 2.2, you'll be on Z11 mode. You cannot fall back to Z2 mode. And that's convenient because what happens in 2.2 is that the JES2 team has added another mode You want to guess what the checkpoint mode in ZOS 2.2 is? Z22, that's right. So they have another mode. So they got rid of Z2 and they added Z22. Okay. And then the general good old motherhood and apple pie, review changes that are applicable to your JES2 exits. I don't know what you have. I don't know what you're doing in there. Some fields have changed within the control blocks. Generally, we rename those fields so that you get an assembly error to indicate to you that you need to change your exit. Just keep on with that. Okay? I don't know how else to say that because you could be doing anything in your exit. And yes, there were some field name changes that might cause you to have an assembly error. But generally, if you don't have an assembly error, generally you're probably okay. Test it and make sure. Okay, JES3. I haven't had a fire for JES3 in a while, but I thought this one was pretty important. John kind of covered it as an enhancement, but I'm looking at it as a migration action. Okay? So what we see here is that JES3 is now going to honor your data set integrity setting that's in your SCED parm lib member. So if you had specified something in your SCED parm lib member for JES3 programs IETINTK and IETINTKF, there's a third one in there, but that's not applicable here, only these two programs for JES2, it used to ignore that setting that you had in there. What's going to happen in JES3 2.2 is that it's not going to be ignored anymore, it's going to be honored. So if you have been, everything's been the same way it's been for decades, all of a sudden your IPL 2.2, the DSI flag is going to be honored, and what that means is that JES3, if it's going to use data set integrity, it's going to perform an NQ on JES3 dynamic allocations, and so it may be that you see unintended consequences by these NQs that are coming out. Okay, so allocations through DD statements are not affected. Okay, these are the dynamic allocations that JES3 does. We recommend that DSI is set, and so you can see that we have a check here now to recommend that you are using data set integrity. Okay. Now, this is one of the health checks. Unless you're using JES3, you're not going to see it because it happens during the initialization path, and if you never go through the initialization path, you never get the check added, you never get the check added, you're never going to see the check. So that's like the data set integrity check that we see here, associated with this action. Okay, now for ZOSMF. Migrate to a new release of ZOSMF. If you were a previous ZOSMF user, which you might be if you were coming from 2.1 or even 13, there is a migrate script that you need to run, and that's going to create a customized parm lib member for you to use. Okay, and if you want to start using ZOSMF, that's a wonderful idea in ZOS 2.2. And in general, there's 3 big steps that you need to do. One of them is security. The next one is you need to create a user.dir file system and a parm lib member. And then the third one is you need to start the server. So that's generally the 3 big steps that you're going to do in ZOSMF 2.2 to start using the function. If you want to start using the function, I would recommend in Server Pack using the full system replace path so that you can have Server Pack assist you with the ZOSMF setup. But if you don't want to use full system replace option in Server Pack, or you use a CBPDO, you can go into the ZOSMF configuration guide and use the samples that are provided there. Generally, that's what the setup actions would entail, those 3 steps. Okay. Now, something that you might notice is that you have to recreate all of your ZOSMF table filters now in ZOS 2.2. Okay, I tried to put a little snapshot here, and I can tell that this is the new ZOSMF 2.2 because I got a sliver of black there, and I know that black is the new motif of ZOSMF 2.2. But here I can see, I tried to show this because this incident log does have a lot of columns here. These, if you had settings in the column, or the columns for ZOSMF before in 2.1 and you set up the filters just the way that you wanted them, you go to 2.2, you're going to have no filters. You got to set them all back up. Actually, I thought it was going to be worse than it has. I've been running with ZOSMF 2.2. I've been using it a lot. And actually, when the filters were removed, I thought it was going to be really annoying. And actually, I've kind of got to the point where I know enough about ZOSMF and I know what filters I really want that I've kind of set them all up from scratch again anyway, just to have the ones that I wanted. Because otherwise I found that I was kind of over-filtering in some cases and not in others, and so it was kind of nice to have a reset and be able to start from scratch again with what I kind of now know as a more experienced user. But just remember that if you have your filters set up exactly the way you want them, there's no filters when you get to 2.2. Okay. That is where is the IZU migrate script? Where is it? It is provided within the product. If you follow in the configuration guide, it will tell you where to find it. Okay, for the ZOS OpenSSH migration actions, I talked in part 1. This is ported code. We really have not a lot of control about how many incompatibilities happen between ported levels because, like I said, ZOS is very careful about trying not to cause incompatibilities, but sometimes with ported products, they don't believe that like we do. And so what you'll see is we're going from 5.0 P1, and then the level that's in ZOS 2.2 is 6.4 P1. Okay, there is a long list of changes that have happened between 5.0 and 6.4. The ones that are the most important, I feel, are the ones that I've put on the chart here, with the one at the top being very important and very common. People have hit this one a lot, in that SSH rand helper command is not supported anymore. If you are going to use dev random, which a lot of people use dev random, you must have crypto up and running on that LPAR. Doesn't mean you have to have purchased crypto cards. You can turn on crypto without having the hardware. You can have it just software crypto. That works fine. That's what a lot of people have done. And so if you need to use dev random, you need to have crypto up and running on that LPAR, or you will not be using dev random, and then that will cause you other problems. So the big thing here is if you are going to be using this, make sure you have crypto up and running on that LPAR, and every LPAR that you need dev random. Now the SFTP, the -P option, the -P option, it used to mean a path, and now it means a port. So given that paths and ports don't look alike, it probably won't work now, okay? So you have to use the -D if you want to specify the path. This is what people in the industry do when they don't understand upward compatibility, right? They do things like this. Okay, SFTP ln command and the symlink subcommands would give you a symbolic link. Now, it won't give you a symbolic link, it'll give you a hard link. And you know that hard link can't cross file systems. So that might cause a problem. If you do want it to be a symbolic link, you need to code a -S explicitly. Okay, and then there's some keywords that weren't supported for version 1. They're not supported for version 1 anymore. You have to update the application if you were using those particular keywords. And there's a bunch of changes in the migration book. These are just a handful of ones I thought that were the most serious. With this one at the top, dev random, requiring crypto as a functional dependency, that is the biggest one that we've seen. Okay, and it seems to be a very common problem. And you will see the error. It will say you're trying to use dev random and you don't have crypto up and running. And you'll be like, oh, I heard about that. I think I should have got that ready, right? Question. Okay, I'm confused about the question because you said there's a PTF on top of it that needs crypto, and I'm telling you the base.
On the ported tools.
It's the same level. It's 6.4 P1. Okay, I didn't understand the question, and maybe it was confusing, but he's saying that there is a PTF on 6.4 P1 that needs crypto, and I'm saying, well, 6.4 P1 needs crypto. And you're saying it's on the ported tools FMID,
Ported tools, FMID,
not the ZOS FMID.
13 or
Yeah.
whatever that would implement this requirement. And you
Okay.
face the music now.
All right, so he's qualifying it a little more, saying the PTF is against ported tools FMID, not the ZOS22 FMID. It's a 6.4 P1 requirement, regardless of where 6.4 P1 is provided, whether it's imported tools or ZOS, you got to have crypto for 6.4 P1.
You can do this now and not have to worry
You could do it now if you have the ported level of OpenSSH. That's correct. That's a good point, Ed. Thanks for bringing that up. If you want to avoid this migration action right now, go put ported tools 1.3 on. That has 6.4 P1 OpenSSH, and then you can deal with all of these things now on 13 or 2.1. Good point, Ed. Thanks. And then you'll have nothing to do. Thank you. Good point. I should have put that on the slide. Okay, next one is in Unix. We need var.man. Okay, man. The man command used to use /var/man. Okay. As of 2.2, we don't use that directory anymore. what we're going to do on ZOS 2.2 is that we're going to put each individual man user's information into the /tmp directory. And it's going to be on an as user basis. So mwali does a man command, and it's going to store some of the information in /tmp/mwali. And then Ed does it, and he's going to have, /tmp/ed. And so everyone's going to have their own files and stuff in TMP now. We're not using a common location of /var/men. We're now using it on a per user basis in /tmp. Okay, what does that mean? That means that you need to go out and remove, as a hygiene action, remove /var/man, because that's not going to be used again anymore, and all of the directories and files underneath that /var/man, right? Don't remove /var, we still need that, right? So /var/man, and then everything underneath it you can get rid of as a clean out item, because we're not going to use that. But now we're going to use /tmp on a per user basis. So this might mean that /tmp may or may not get large, depending on how many users you have that issue the man command. See? Okay, so monitor TMP space usage and ensure adequate space for users so that they can use the man command. All right. And then here are a couple of items that were from 2.1, and I don't have enough time to cover those, so I will move through that. But what I wanted to do at this point is now recap the big MIGs. Okay, the big MIGs are, I divided them up this presentation now between 2.1, and then on this chart it's for 13 to 2.2. So for the first path users, if you're on a 2.1 going to 2.2, here are the big MIGs for you. Okay, you have 6 of them. That's not very many. Usually we've had about 10 or 12 on a release. So when I look at the entire 2.1 to 2.2 path, I'm not seeing a lot of big MIGs. But I'm seeing the worst big MIG I've ever seen, which is number 1, which is the Domino to Apache move. So if that one counts as one, that should count as 100 of them, right? All right, so we've got this one, and I made it in red, and I put it as number 1. So I don't know how else to inform you that that is a big migration action, and that's something that we really need to do. And hopefully you won't have an impact from it. The second one, we talked about formatting the ARM couple data set. If you don't do it, then you won't be able to use ARM. Next one was SMB. If you don't put this statement in your envar file, you will not be able to use SMB. These are easy to do. 2 and 3 are easy to do, but I'm not going to say that number 1 is easy to do. Okay, number 4, it looked like a lot of people here had already moved up to Z11 mode, and so that's good. The next one was JES3, just being aware that we're going to use the setting that is specified now. We're not going to ignore it anymore. And then OpenSSH changed that ported tools level, with the biggest one being the dev random, needing crypto. But the comment, of course, was an excellent comment that accommodate that one now by using ported tools. We have checks for number 1 and number 4 as well to help. Okay, now if you're coming from 13 to 2.2, what do you have to do? Well, you have to do everything on this prior slide, so you've got to do these 6. In addition, you have the big MIGs that were introduced in 2.1, which are number 1, top of the list, bpx.default.user. That was the biggest one that we saw in 2.1. And then look where I put number 2. I put that one as a recommended one because I still want you to make sure you do that. And then we have making sure that you've got health checker up and running. Make sure you check the cache size default changes for ZFS. Make sure you're using crypto for FIPS 140. And also look at default values for ZFS that have changed as well. Okay, so 13 to 2.2 people, you guys have like a dozen big MIGs to look at. Okay. And then here's just a summary of all of the other non-big MIG items if you wanted to look at. Remember, general migration action, we had spaces, removed data sets, changed checks. For BCP, we had that logger CDS going back to the 2001 level that we recommend that you use, but we've also changed the default so that if you reformat a logger couple data set, that will give you the circa 2001 level of the data set. HWI BCPII needing read authority, and also PARMDD and region X being restricted from JCL and proc, JCL exec and proc statements if there were symbols. COM server, we talked about each stack needing its own PFID if you're only coming from 2.1. The queued that should be queued. There should be a D in there. Queued run, return trip time, round trip time, default change, a doubling of the CSM default from 100 meg to 200 meg, and those syslog messages having threads in them. We talked about DFSMS, and now that refresh UCB is the default. And if you want to change it, that's fine, but you should go and also update the check parm to make sure that we're verifying what you want us to verify. The list dump class command output, things have moved over, new fields are appearing in it. Verify offline device, a default change for ICK DSF if you're specifying in the init and reformat, and you meet all those conditions, right, at the right microcode level. It's not a disk, it's not a mini disk. Then it will process as if verify offline was there. So if it's not offline, you will see an error now, even though you didn't specify verify offline. Exit changes, that's the general one we have. OSMF, make sure you got to migrate the configuration, or maybe start to use it as a new user would be a good idea. And then the table filters, which I don't think are as bad as I had thought. I'm actually living with that one okay. I was worried about it, but I'm doing okay with that one now. And then var man removals for Unix. So that's all it. 2 hours of migrating to 2.2. Yeah.
Only you could migrate to 2 hours.
Yeah. The comment was, if it only took 2 hours to migrate to 2.2. I wish. All right, thank you very much for coming, and have a good time on your migration.
Because we're sharing.